Every journey begins with a single step. For our friend, the hydrogen atom, that step is a bold leap from being part of a water molecule to an emissary of energy. In the heart of an electrolysis chamber, powered by renewable energy, water is transformed. Oxygen steps back, releasing the vibrant hydrogen atom. Alone, hydrogen is volatile, but when paired with captured CO2 and the help of a touch of alchemy, together, they forge a potent synthetic fuel. A new energy carrier, clean, efficient, ready to power our world. Innovative companies are investing in the production of eFuels, which can then be distributed via the existing infrastructure to industry and consumers, providing them with a climate-friendly alternative to conventional fossil fuels. Aviation, maritime, heavy goods transport, even your car, eFuels power a wide range of sectors and offer a sustainable solution to our diverse energy and mobility needs. We at the eFuel Alliance embrace the entire value chain and give it a face and a voice. Our goal is political acceptance and regulatory consideration of eFuels as a significant contribution to sustainable climate protection. In the quest for green energy, eFuels are an essential piece of the puzzle, linking today's infrastructure to a more sustainable future. The eFuel Alliance is powering this transition, forging a path from hydrogen to hope, because the future of energy is now.
Dear participants, dear colleagues and friends, welcome to our webinar with renewable fuels towards security and resilience. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning. In recent years, we have all been reminded in a very sobering way how closely energy, security, military readiness, and geopolitical stability are connected. When fuel supply chains become vulnerable, it is not only our economies that are at risk, but our security infrastructure as a whole. Our central question today are: how can renewable fuels contribute to European military fuel readiness and support NATO's defense strategies and logistics? And how can large-scale e-fuel projects help create homegrown renewable fuels in Europe, serving as a dual-use backbone for both civilian and military demand? The eFuel Alliance, from its very start in 2020, has encountered that e-fuels can be an important tool to diversify our energy supply and also to strengthen the resilience of our value chains. Already in March 2022, we presented a position paper to underline the possible contribution of industrialized e-fuel production in Europe, but also in a global scale, not only to reduce fossil fuels to reduce CO2 emissions, but also to strengthen and diversify our energy supply to make it more resistant and secure to meet geopolitical crises we are facing in an unprecedented way. Since then, we have to recognize that geopolitical crises are not only happening around us, but that the EU is increasingly in the center of it. Russia is increasingly threatening the EU as a whole. The comeback of war as a reality in Europe has huge consequences on our positions and policies. In addition, it becomes more clear every day that the United States under President Trump switched camp from being a reliable ally to those large powers threatening us directly. This has to have further consequences for the EU and its policies. How can we increase our readiness to defend ourselves? How can we be more resilient and independent in our value chains and our energy supply? And what role can e-fuels play in all this in the future? This event is the first attempt to address these and many other questions. We are very pleased to be joined by three distinguished speakers: Irina Patrahau, a strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, who will speak on European military fuel readiness, the role of alternative fuels in military logistics. She will help us to understand how armed forces are beginning to integrate alternative and renewable fuels into their planning and what this means in our practice for security of supply. Maximilian Backhaus is the Chief Commercial Officer of Interreg, a pioneer in the production of eFuels, who will bring in the technical and project development views. How can we scale e-fuel production in Europe and build the kind of network of renewable fuel capacities that makes our fuel supply more robust in times of crisis? And Sheena Britzen from Rheinmetall presenting the Project Vision Giga PTX. This perspective from a major defense and technology company will show how industrial-scale PTX and e-fuel projects can underpin secure and sustainable fuel supplies for defense. This session will be moderated by Ralf Diemer, our CEO of the eFuel Alliance, who many of you know very well already. After the presentation, we look forward to an interactive Q&A with all of you. So please feel invited to share your questions and comments in the chat. Thank you very much for joining us, for your interest and for your engagement in this crucial debate. And with them, I am delighted to hand over to our moderator, Ralf Diemer. Ralf, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica, for this kind introduction. Also from my side, a warm welcome to all of you. We are reaching 100, I assume, in the next minute or so. So very happy that you joined our first Teams meeting. We can already see in the platform we are using that security subjects are obviously kind of different to our other subjects. So I'm very happy that we could switch that easily and that so many of you joined us on this pathway. Now, Monica already introduced our speakers, so I won't have a long introductory remarks from my side. We will start with Irina Patrahau, sorry. She's presenting us this issue we want to discuss today more from a scientific side, because she and her team did conduct her team from HCSS, which is the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, conducted actually a study with the title European Military Fuel Readiness, the Role of Alternative Fuels in Military Logistics. And we thought it might be a good idea, since this is the first event of this kind we are doing to this subject as eFuel Alliance. I might add, I'm very sure it won't be the last on this subject. It would be a good idea if Irina would present the findings of the study so that we have, so to speak, a groundwork layout then for our two other speakers who happen to be more the practical side and who happen to be also partners in their project. That is also one of the reasons why we wanted to invite both of those companies to our event. So without further ado, if you have any questions from the audience, please put them into the F&A chat. As always, as Jan already stated, I will try to introduce them when it fits, but usually our practice is that we have the three speakers first and that we then have a Q&A session, and you can address your questions to any speaker or to all three of them. That's of course up to you. Again, Irina, warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ralf, and thank you to the eFuel Alliance for having me this morning and organizing this interesting webinar. I will share my screen in 1 second with some slides. You should be able to see them now. Great. So good morning again. My name is Irina Patrahau, and I'm a strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. We're an independent think tank based in the Netherlands. And there we conduct a lot of work under our energy security program, which I lead. I added the covers of some of the recent reports that we have made. The most important of which being on top of in front of the screen. Ralph already alluded to one of them, but I would like to explain a bit how we reached this question and how we started researching it. We started earlier in 2025, so early last year, with a question from industry about military logistics and what the needs of the military are, how military logistics work, what are their plans for the coming years. And we didn't start looking just at alternative fuels. We started looking at military fuels and military readiness within Europe, and tried to identify what the main bottlenecks were and what the opportunities were to improve this issue. And following from that, we also organized an event where we brought together some industry representatives with military representatives. And I'm mentioning this also because one of the main issues in solving this broader challenge is that the industry and the military haven't been in touch much. There's not a lot of dialogue from what we've noticed within the Netherlands, also within the EU level and NATO. There are a lot of plans, of course, that the military has, but they're used to treat fuel as a commodity. So they're used to always having it available. They're used to whenever they wake up and they require all of a sudden some extra jet fuel, they will receive it because the market has been working quite well for quite a long time. But things are changing now, and that requires a reconsideration of how military logistics work. So I'll take you through some of the findings from these two papers that I mentioned. They're also available on our website, so if for anybody who is interested. So first of all, what does the European military fuel infrastructure look like? Well, we have looked into it a bit, and our conclusion is that it's quite fragmented and it's quite outdated. It's fragmented because it is every member state, of course, every country has their own fuel infrastructure. There are some NATO pipeline systems, as they call them. The biggest of one is the Central Europe pipeline system, which is here shown on the slide, and that covers 5 countries. There is the North Europe pipeline system that covers Denmark and Germany, and there's several other national pipeline systems. But it's not like the military has its own supply chain, its own logistics that is completely independent from the civilian market. The supply chains are very much interlinked up until the point where the military purchases at the moment, mainly the oil, at the end of the civilian logistics, and it becomes the military supply chain. That's when, until now, the military was concerned with. But of course, the military supply chain doesn't start when you buy the fuel and take it to the battlefield. It starts much earlier, and that's a mindset that we need to sort of work with and try to make more mainstream, because it's, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's no longer that this fuel is a commodity and it's always available. And the military, they also have to start thinking more broadly about the supply chain and what it looks like and what the bottlenecks are. At the same time, it's outdated, and I will also move to the next slide because it is dating since the Cold War period, meaning that there's a large imbalance between the West and the East of Europe. Here, there's a graph or a figure, I suppose, of the kerosene stock levels in the different countries. You can see that the eastern flank of NATO has very little stock levels and storage levels, whereas the west of Europe has much more. It's the same with crude oil refining capacity because, well, you need the refining capacity to produce the jet fuel that is used by the military. And the CEPS, so the biggest NATO pipeline system, ends also in Germany. So we might have the fuels available, but are we able to bring them to the battlefield, which, assuming it would be the eastern flank, in a rapid way whenever we need it? That is a question that we're trying to solve. And another point to make here is that some of you may know that NATO has a so-called single fuel concept, whereby if there's a conflict situation, both the land forces and the air forces will use jet fuel, so the same fuel, to make logistics more easy, which is also why jet fuel and kerosene in this case are shown on the slide, because it's the main fuel of the military. So in this research, we've identified 5 bottlenecks along the supply chain that we think inhibit fuel readiness within Europe. And essentially, they cover every part of the supply chain. So it starts with the high crude oil import dependence that Europe has. That in itself perhaps is not such a large issue, but the fact that we also have a shrinking refining capacity and that's not geographically well distributed, it's also an issue because you cannot get to the jet fuel that you need at the battlefield. We have inadequate distribution lines. So we have the steps, of course, that ends in Germany. We have a couple of other pipeline systems that are national, but it is not a given that the crude oil that we import to the Netherlands, for instance, which is one of the main gateways of Europe, will easily get to the eastern flank when we need it to. The storage capacity is not always sufficient either, considering that you might need some additional stocks to prepare for quick mobilization. And finally, and this is perhaps where it gets more interesting for the group here, there's also a lot of challenges to maintaining both the fossil and the sustainable fuel supply chains in the energy transition, because like it or not, the military is dependent on civilian supply chains. So if there's changes taking place in the civilian market, this will force the military to reconsider their logistics and their supply chains. So then we asked ourselves the question, how do we manage this energy transition, acknowledging that we don't assume that tomorrow the military will start only using sustainable or alternative fuels, but they will have to start considering it and integrating it in their planning. So as I mentioned again, we didn't start with the consideration of, okay, we have alternative fuels and how can we make the military use more of those? We started with the consideration the military needs fuels. How do we make sure that there is enough fuels? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how this fuel was produced, whether it's a fossil fuel, whether it's an e-fuel, just a biofuel. At the end of the day, it matters that it fulfills the performance requirements that the military has, and they have it abundantly at the battlefield. So we've individuated 5 principles of military fuel use, again, regardless of the origin or the production pathway. So availability, it needs to be widely abundant when the military needs it. Flexibility is very important. So as I mentioned, land troops or tanks normally would run on diesel, but they can also run on jet fuel according to the single fuel concept. At the end of the day, again, ideally you would have the fuel that fits the system the best, but if there's a battle situation, you just need a fuel for the tank to run. So it doesn't really matter what it goes in there, it just matters that the tank runs. Logistic simplicity and speed. So more simple it is, the better. It has to have stable and reliable performance, of course, so it has to be certified. And something that is perhaps a bit different from the civilian markets, the military doesn't just look at the cost of buying the fuel once it's been produced. Of course, that is a consideration, but costs for the military are also the convoys that deliver the fuel to the battlefield. And it's not just a financial cost, it can also be a human capital cost. It can also be, it's a very dangerous job, in fact, for the military to transport this fuel. A lot of fatalities on the battlefield in Afghanistan, for instance, took place when they were transporting the fuel. So at the end of the day, perhaps if the fuel is more expensive, relatively speaking, but everything else around it makes it easy to use it, that might be a more important consideration. Which leads us to, the following. If we assume, or we know that the fossil fuel production capabilities will be declining in the next years, we have more import dependency. So if the military continues to only need jet fuel, but we have less ability to produce it, that means we will be even more dependent on imports. But at the same time, in the short term, we know that the sustainable fuel market doesn't have the size that we need for the military to be able to fully replace fossil fuels with alternatives. So in the sort of short to mid-term, we suggested that drop-in fuels are the most attractive option for the military because they fulfill all of the considerations that I mentioned earlier. So they add to the availability of fuels because there's just more of it. It provides flexibility because you can blend some of it with the fossil fuels. If they're not available, you don't have to, but you can. So it provides a lot of alternative options and diversification options. And generally, they are, especially synthetic fuel, they are produced in Europe. So that brings a lot of benefits for strategic autonomy. And here in the table, we looked at the main conventional fuels that are used across the different domains. So as I mentioned, jet fuel is actually the main one because it's also the single fuel concept, but there's also some diesel that is being used in land and maritime systems. And we essentially saw that there are a lot of fuel alternatives. If you look at advanced biofuels for SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, renewable diesel, and also, of course, eSAF and e-diesel. They can be blended with the conventional fuels, and they bring a lot of benefits. And in fact, they don't really bring any downsides, especially if you adopt this incremental approach with the drop-in fuels. So just to wrap up, again, all of the analyses are also available on our website, and I'm also here, of course, for questions. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that civilian fossil fuel availability and logistics infrastructure is changing forces the military to reassess its readiness, its fuel readiness. It doesn't matter what kind of fuel production pathway the military uses, it just matters that they have the fuel and that it fulfills their needs. We believe an answer to how to manage the energy transition before we are fully able to use alternative fuels. Well, you can use drop-in fuels. They have no downsides really other than that they need to be extra blended at the beginning, but that can be done easily. We also know that the scale of the industry has not yet kicked in, even though it would be in both the civilian and military's interest to do so. And just a sort of final note that we have considered synthetic and bio-based methanol as well as ammonia, but we consider that in the short term, they are not as fit for military use as the other options that I mentioned, just because from a logistics perspective, they complicate matters a bit too much. That's where I will end. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions in a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irina. So we do this for 4.5 years now in the eFuel Alliance. I think that is the first event that a speaker says eFuels have no downsides. So thank you very much for that. Took us a while, but not too bad in that respect. Thank you very much. Already some questions are popping up. We will come to them later on. I would immediately pass over to our next speaker, which is Maximilian Backhaus. He is the Chief Commercial Officer, CCO. I need to be careful with these short cuts of Ineratec. Ineratec, of course, is a very well-known e-fuel producer and technology provider, also a long-standing member of the eFuel Alliance. Active in very many different fields of e-fuel production, and lately also publicly known as active in the potential e-fuel production for military by partnering with Rheinmetall on their project, which will be introduced also by Sheena Britzen later. So Maximilian has actually a long-standing career in different areas of the industry. Before he joined Ineratec, he worked in a very different place. He worked quite long for HelloFresh, and did accompany the company in their growth into several markets. He has a long-standing also international experience to analyze and enter into different markets. Therefore, a very important person also working with Ineratec. So we are very interested and keen to hear your view as a fuel producer on the subject. Maximilian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ralph. And Yes, very excited about doing this, and thanks for also like setting the scene so well, Irina. I think what I will focus on in my presentation and now today is giving you a little bit more of a deep dive into the technology, like where it's at, like what the key advantages are also with regards to resilience, and then Sina is going to round it out like into the whole concept, like how something like GigaPTX would come together. So bear with me like for a little bit, like as we go into some more technical details. Okay, 1 sec. Can you see my screen?
It's loading. Now
Yeah.
we can, yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So yeah, basically, quick intro on Ineratech, like at the beginning, and then I'll go into the decentral fuel synthesis, like how would that work? We'll take a look at a case study of the plant that we just built in Frankfurt Höchst, so in the center of Germany. And then I'll also talk a little bit about like how we've seen the role of decentral eFuels production actually already getting some airtime at higher political levels, etc. So like maybe like giving us some hope that there's real momentum behind this topic. But first, let's take a quick glance at what Ineratech actually is. So Ineratech, for those of you who haven't been following us so much, like is at its core a technology company. So what we do is we produce the technology that can turn green hydrogen, CO2, and renewable energy in a first step in a Fischer-Tropsch process into waxes and synthetic crude. And we also have the technology that allows us to turn this into synthetic kerosene, so commonly called eSAF. We can also make e-diesel, for example, very closely related. We also always like make a small fraction of naphtha, but really like the fuels are the core of what we do. So the company like has patents, especially around the electrified production of synthesis gas with a reverse water gas shift reactor. So it's a very, very important piece. A microstructured Fischer-Tropsch reactor. So you have to think about it like normally like these installations are really huge. At KIT, like 25 years ago, they found a way to make this a lot smaller. You can tell I'm not the chemical process engineer. I'm the business person in the company. And we've also like come up with a way that allows us to do a modular upgrading of the products that we produce. But more on that later. Ineratech was founded about 10 years ago, right out of KIT. So we have our 10-year anniversary this summer, headquartered in Germany, in Karlsruhe, so center of Europe, like spin-off of the university, currently trading at around like 160 employees, like always going up and down quite a bit. Majority of the people like are not really producing or presenting slides. They're really like in there with the screwdriver, like in front of like computer-aided design. They're engineers that have over time like really produced like broad patent families. Over all this time, the company has already completed more than 15 projects. So there's quite a long-standing history. Like in the beginning, they were small. Like now they're getting larger and larger, like as you will see shortly. And over this time, we've also like racked up more than 40,000 operating hours. So quite some experience, like quite practically, like with this technology. Worked with more than 30 customers, and yeah, all this like cost quite some money. So we had to raise some capital. We'll also continue to raise. And at the bottom, I'm not going to go into the details here, like you see a little bit of glimpse of the broad-ranging portfolio of companies like backing Ineratech at this point. So this is us, and we believe that we can really like facilitate what Irina pointed out to, like what we desperately need in Europe right now in order to supply our NATO forces. So this is the concept in essence. Basically, as I said before, we always like start with renewable energy. We make green hydrogen, or we source that from somewhere. We obtain ideally biogenic CO2. The only requirement here is that it has a certain purity, and then it goes into our fuel synthesis. So the big box that you see in the middle houses the reverse water gas shift and the Fischer-Tropsch reactors, which then turn those gases into liquid products and somewhat solid product, at least like at room temperature, solid waxes. Those waxes you can either use directly. We've also like seen people like run some experiments like on the crude, like whether this can be actually operated in vehicles even. But normally, like in order to get to the full spec products, we also need to feed it like through upgrading. Here we have the upgrading technology, which we also like have in a modular format. It works a little bit different than from what is like out there in the market. Not going to go into the technical details here, but it is quite handy. It is quite efficient. And it allows us to produce the drop-in ready eFuels, so e-diesel, eSAF, exactly like what the military needs to supply that into different applications in the end. There's also like a neat side stream of naphtha, which has a great application, like also in the chemical industry, also like in the fuel industry. How do we? Let's go a little bit like into how we make those turnkey fuel production plants. What's quite interesting here and a little bit different from what you normally see in the market is that Ineratec produces its turnkey plants actually in a factory. So we don't start casting concrete and then we basically like assemble screw by screw like on site, but we actually do that in Karlsruhe in our manufacturing facility. In a serial production setup. So there's really like an assembly line initially like of the reactors, the reverse water gas shift and the Fischer-Tropsch. And those are then like put into more or less standard containers. They're installed in a way that everything works, including the automation. It's pre-installed actually locally on site and checked. The factory acceptance test is like super comprehensive. And then only then it is shipped on site and being installed. And this modularity actually like allows us to not only like install fairly quickly, but also like install at any size because we're producing these reactors anyway. So the question is just like how many reactors and how many modules we ship on site so we can adapt to like whatever is available locally in terms of hydrogen and in terms of CO2. And as you will see, this is actually quite a critical aspect like of our technology in terms of like enabling this decentral setup because it really reduces the requirements on the specific site where you install it. Because when you look at like very, very large scale technology in Germany, there are not that many sites where you can put it. The Ineratec technology you can actually put in a lot of different places, just very, very simply speaking. And now going into the case study in Frankfurt, like what you've probably like seen in the media, in the middle of last year, we opened our Era 1 facility. It's the largest project that we've done so far. So I mentioned before, like it's not the first. We've done 15 projects. This is project number 15 or so, where we've really like installed in an industrial park a demonstration facility. Demonstration facility means it still serves the purpose of proving out the technology, but it also is producing at quite some scale. So it already like proves out the market and also allows us and the military to test these fuels that are coming out and seeing like whether it like fits what they need. So the capacity of the plant right now is 2.5 kilotons. So for those of you familiar with the requirements of fuel like in Europe, that's not much, but the next steps actually like mean a significant numbering up of the reactors and then also like producing significantly more and making an impact on the market. So what's interesting in the setup in Frankfurt, we receive the CO2 and hydrogen like from a pipe. So this is the light green pipe that you see a little bit in the background of the picture here. But essentially, as I mentioned before, this can be replaced by any also decentralized production of hydrogen or CO2. So we're very, very flexible there. The only thing that matters really like is that we have some sort of solid ground that we can put our containers on really. This is a bit of a more detailed snapshot. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through in too much detail. Just to explain to you, the white boxes in the center, that is the fuel synthesis. The black box that you see in the background, that is a fairly large control room, visitor hall, and compressor hall setup. So in a normal case like this would be smaller sized to the synthesis unit. It's just because it's our demonstration plant and we tend to get a lot of guests. Maybe some of you like have been there already. And at the bottom, or like more towards the left, you have storage tanks, and what is provided like as a rendering here next to the plant is the upgrading, which is currently under construction. So we have like everything in a quite compact setup, like in one place. You don't need a refinery in the end, but what is there, like in the blue tanks, is actually the drop-in ready fuel. One more thing that's quite interesting about this technology and the way that we've developed it, because we always like wanted to be very modular and wanted to be adaptable to the supply sources of CO2 and hydrogen. We knew we would actually not deploy this as a gigantic like chemical plant usually, but smaller. And that's when when you also need to be efficient in terms of like who operates this. And everything that we've built is actually set up in a way that it can be remote controlled. So our command center, for example, in Frankfurt, is set up in a way that it allows it to remote control a lot of other sites, like in different places all around Germany or Europe. So it's really like the backbone. And this is also probably like what sets it quite apart, like from some of the more traditional infrastructure. And in the case of GigaPTX, as Sina will get to in a little bit, it allows us to operate in a very efficient way the decentralized setup without having really like a huge amount of highly specialized personnel in a lot of places. So let's go a little bit like through like how this technology like fits in with resilience. And as I already mentioned, the modularity is one of the key components. So it can deploy small, it can deploy big, but there's other advantages here as well. So the very, very high standardization I mentioned before, this is like made in a factory, like all the modules look the same. They actually like make installation and maintenance very quick and convenient. It also has a bit of a built-in resilience in there. So if you imagine that in a conflict scenario, parts of it get damaged, replacing them is fairly easy and fairly quick, unlike in a normal chemical plant. And maybe Sina will get to that later. I'm not the expert on this, but fortifying such a structure is also much more simple. Like you have like more cubic reactors instead of like insanely large columns that are basically impossible to put underground. So like a certain fortification level is also something that we can achieve in this setup. Needless to say, I mentioned earlier, I think the last plant we set up, it was a little bit smaller than this, 24 hours, like to plug everything in on the ground, because it was basically pre-tested. The other thing that obviously is also like when we talk about resilience is relatively important is the fact that all of this, like the production, the engineering, the design, everything is done in Germany. So this is like an end-to-end German supply chain at this point, which does help. It's a technology like where we're really like leading locally, worldwide, nothing to hide here. And also has great benefits, like when we're making these investments into resilience infrastructure, that a lot of the jobs like will land locally. And lastly, like it's not in the picture, but we do have upgrading. I mean, there's clearly like a single fuel strategy in NATO. So like we want to go towards kerosene in a conflict scenario. But in the end, like our upgrading is also flexible. So you can say like in a non-conflict scenario, we also produce diesel, for example. That's quite easily possible. So rounding it out, I think we've been discussing this idea like now quite a bit over a couple of months, and we're really like starting to see traction. We see some momentum and an understanding. I think what Irina presented in the beginning is like fairly self-evident. You look at the facts and you see that there is a problem. The vulnerability is absolutely there. So this is on the radar. Some of you may have seen it towards the back end of last year. There's been a military mobility communication by the European Commission, which actually like asked for this dispersed type of production capacity. So quite interesting to see that they're picking up on it. And clearly, like the success that we've seen, like with the initial demonstration of the fuel synthesis in Frankfurt, may have contributed. So rounding it up, some messages I wanted to leave you with. The technology that is required for dispersed production of eFuels already exists. We've not demonstrated the GigaPTX setup, but we have demonstrated key aspects of the core, the fuel synthesis already in Germany. This is working, and what we're quite excited about, and I'm really happy that we're having this webinar here today, is that some momentum is building around this topic, and this is really something where we can move things together and have some great benefits, like both on the civilian and also like on the military side.
Thank you very much, Maximilian, for these very interesting and comprehensive insights. We have already a lot of questions, and there are some very concrete questions to you, Maximilian, in the chat. So maybe you could already look into it. So even some people are asking for your fuel specifically to buy. So that might be something you could answer directly in the chat. The more general questions we will bring up afterwards. But now, our last but not least speaker, Sheena Britzen. She's head of hydrogen program at Rheinmetall. Of course, Rheinmetall, a very well-known company, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, you could say. I think not only in Germany, all over the place when it comes to defense in particular, although we know Rheinmetall is not only a defense company. I know from my past in the German Association of the Automotive Industry that Rheinmetall is also an automotive supplier. But of course, in the moment, the defense part is key. Rheinmetall launched a project, which is Project Vision GigaPTX. And Sheena will present that to us. Maybe one additional remark. She's in Rheinmetall since 2009. She's an engineer, and she also was a soldier for 12 years in the German army, and at the end, an artillery officer for multiple launch rocket systems. So I think more insight in what we are discussing right now is nearly not possible, and therefore we are very happy to have you, Sheena. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ralf, and thanks for having me. My pleasure on talking a little bit on our Project Vision GigaPTX. It's been ages since I've been in the forces, but you never lose those kind of connections. And let me just be clear before I get into this. I am not a warmonger, neither is Rheinmetall. So I saw some questions in the chat regarding greening the planet and looking to biodiversity and saving us from the overheating of the planet. But in order to do that, it's not the eFuels that answer this question. It's more us as humanity not voting and electing those leaders that we are currently seeing in large portions of the world that are driving the world towards instability. So what we are providing is an answer to this setup, not saying it can't resolve, but the question at this stage is honestly, how do we secure what we have in Europe? And therefore, eFuels and fuels for armed forces are a critical component, just to kind of set the scene that nobody kind of wants us to be engaging in any wartime scenarios. So sharing my screen and going to full screen. I hope you can see my screen. Just a second, I'm just gonna do this that way. Okay, the Project Vision GigaPTX that we have in place and where Inerotech is one of our key partners, basically touches on what Irina already has indicated and has told us. The greatest weakness in Europe that we're currently still facing in case of any war of aggression, particularly from Russia, is fuel production and logistics. So this is clear what we are seeing. If you look into how the Ukraine conflict has evolved over time, after the initial basically airborne operations when the war started in 2022, we saw the old kind of fighting scheme where it came to artillery engagements that were quite intense between Russia and Ukraine, and with artillery ammunition spent going up to 80,000 rounds a month, which is a lot. So basically what we saw in the European defense community was a very, very sharp increase in the demand of artillery ammunition supply. And we as Rheinmetall are a key manufacturer of this kind of ammunition, amongst others. And basically we've been working 3-4 shifts, 24/7, producing artillery ammunition to fuel the needs in regards to that ammunition in Ukraine. What we then saw was, on top of the artillery engagement, that drones came into the battlefield scenarios and the battlefield reality. So starting small scales, this has also ramped up. So basically it's attacking with drones and defending against, which is how we saw anti-aircraft needs coming up towards the defense industry to be supplied into Ukraine. But we also honestly have now the broad discussion on how we cope with the drone threat. And drones have made artillery strikes way more precise because they give you surveillance and you know where to shoot. So they actually increase the effectivity on artillery on the battlefield. And what came from that, and this is what we're seeing quite clearly at this stage, is the energy war, the war on fuel supply. Because both parties have quickly understood that if there's a plant that produces artillery ammunition and you cut it from electrical power, or you take away the fuel for an air force or for tanks, well, basically nothing happens. So everything starts with energy. So if you can cripple an enemy's or an adversary's energy supply, everything else just stops. So it's the most effective way on determining how a conflict ends. So if we look what is happening today, Russia already has lost 15% of its refining capacity due to Ukrainian deep strikes. And Russia, on the other hand, can't be that effective on Ukraine because Ukraine is supplying its fuel from further west. Russia would have to attack NATO countries in the west to have the same effect on the fuel supply and the fuel availability in Ukraine compared to what Ukraine is doing in Russia at this stage. So we're seeing this. And Ukraine doesn't have an air force. It's predominantly army forces fighting there. And they already need 2,500 tons of fuel per day to sustain their combat operations. So, and what we have to be clear on and really be very much focusing on, Ukraine is setting the baseline for any other conflict to come after this. So when this war ends, and my thesis is that it's coming to an end to some sort of peace agreement because Russia is understanding that it will have a crippled fuel infrastructure and will have to surrender if the fighting continues because of Ukraine being so effective. So, however, this sets the baseline for the next war after the war with Ukraine. So the next war will be artillery and drones and fuel infrastructure, which is exactly what GigaPTX is an answer towards, to prepare us to be unattackable in regards to that combat dimension. So Irina has touched on this, but just to give you some quantities, if you go for a demand in how much fuel we need, estimate 20 to 60 liters per soldier per fighting day. That gives you a good kind of rule of thumb how much fuel we need in a wartime scenario. So give or take, estimate for Europe to be able to sustain a war, full-scale war, we need 20 million tons of fuel per year. So if you go back to what Irina just had on her slides, giving the kerosene storage capacity, that will last for 3 months. So we'll have kerosene for 3 months of fighting, and then we are done. And all our infrastructure in regards to fuel is relying on us importing fuel into Europe. We can't produce the fuel because we do not have the oil in Europe in those quantities available that we actually could have enough fuel to be supplying our armed forces. So we will run dry. And that is what any attacker will be targeting because it's our greatest weakness. And Irina touched on the logistics, and there's some numbers from Afghanistan. 60% of all killed and wounded from NATO and its helping forces because of logistics, with fuel logistics. And also the dilemma, fuel in wartime is super expensive. And that's our problem, as Irina touched on. In peacetime, it's a commodity. It must not cost anything. And in wartime, people say it doesn't matter what it will cost. And that kind of a dilemma is what we also want to touch and resolve with GigaPTX. So I saw the question in the chat regarding electricity, and also in regards to renewables. The interesting thing, which is great, is the most resilient fuel is the fuel from green local energy sources, because they are always available. Wind, sun, geothermal, and hydropower, they just don't care whether it's war or peacetime. They are always there. You can always harvest this. So if you take the renewables, this gives you the most steady and the most reliable supply in regards to your primary source of energy to be converting into fuel. So basically, on top of that, you can't rely on the grid. We're seeing this. The grid is so vulnerable, and even if it was to be protectable, it will take ages to build, and it's super expensive. So for any kind of resilient fuel supply, we'll have to rely on local energy production, and that's the renewables. There are some of those ideas on small modular reactors and going for things like this. We don't see them to be feasible, because you don't want to have 4,000 reactors kind of distributed over Europe. That kind of damage and that kind of nuclear contamination, if those are attacked, is way too big compared to having cheap solar and wind power available. We're also questioning, in principle, the need for this kind of single fuel policy of NATO on the Central European pipeline system. Why? Because GigaPTX is a project vision where you have distributed plants all over Europe. So go for the coastal areas where we produce marine diesel. Go for where the airstrips are, because bombers and fighter jets, they need fixed infrastructure anyway, and build SAF clusters. And then look into your blank spots on the map and fill them with diesel plants. So basically, from a visionary perspective, wherever you are as a fighting force, you're never far more away than 50 to 100 kilometers from where there is a fuel depot and fuel is produced. And also the methanol discussion. I actually kind of struggle while we're doing this, because you still need the CO2 to actually build the methanol, and you will have to change the logistics system. The logistics system that we have built globally is basically all hydrocarbon-based fuels coming from crude oil. It's not methanol-based. So, and if you run the cost on how much it will cost to kind of change our naval forces on a global scale, Western world, to methanol, for what? There's no gain in this from a fighting perspective. So I understand where the methanol discussion is coming from. The civilian industry might go there, and we might see this in naval forces in 50 years to come, but it's not a question to be done today. It will just take too long. So the point is, whatever we can do to provide plug-in fuels, drop-in fuels that are usable in today's infrastructure is what we can do short-term, and it does the job. It provides the energy, it is green, and it doesn't mean that we have significant financial exposures to actually get this into operation. Also the discussion, we don't have enough power. It's just wrong. So this is an example from Denmark, and just giving you some quantities, and you might run the math on your own as well, of course. Just look at Denmark. Denmark in 2020 lost 1,463 gigawatt hours electrical and renewable energy, because there was insufficient grid capacity and storage limitations. You can't store electricity. Don't go with the batteries, just doesn't work. A battery Leopard 2 would weigh 105 tons compared to the 70 tons, and you still couldn't charge it because you can't deliver the energy to the front line. So, and if you take this kind of amount of electrical energy that just was lost in Denmark, this would have been enough wartime demand for 10,000 soldiers. So the issue is not having enough electricity. Our population in Europe is used to the PV fields. They're used to the windmills, so you actually can build them, which means we'll have enough electricity available to be producing the fuel that we need. Electricity is not a scarce resource. It's hard to transport, it's hard to store, but it's not hard to produce. And that's the point why this kind of suggestion, yeah, we can't do this because we don't have enough electrical power, is just wrong. So what is GigaPTX? GigaPTX, the way we see it, is a Europe-wide network of decentralized large-scale production plants for synthetic fuel. Large-scale production plants in inverted commas. Compared to what HIF Global is doing or other companies are doing, it's small. Each plant is configured for an output of 5,000 tons on an annual basis. It's configured around the energy supply on site, right? So remember, all the energy comes from renewable on-site sources. So we can't have 100 windmills. 10 will have to do. Combining solar and wind, because they're additive sources in Europe. And that kind of defines the output of 5,000 tons. Compared to what we have today, that's big. Compared to what other companies have been trying, it's small. We consider them large-scale production plants. But it's not going to be 1, 2, or 10. We aim at least 1,500 of those in Europe to be actually achieving this distributed approach and providing those 20.5 million tons. And each plant has, in its very core design, and this is why Narratex technology is so crucial to the project, is based around resilience. So it's not optimized on cost, it's optimized on resilience. It produces the ready-to-use fuel from on-site renewable energy sources. It will not require a public power grid connection. In peacetime, of course, we'd connect this to produce more fuel, but the way it is designed is not requiring this. It will achieve its annual design output yield with pure renewable on-site. It must not require any other feedstock than water and CO2. CO2, short-term, we take point sources like cement plants, like paper and pulp mills, stuff like this, with amine washing, proven technology, with a perspective towards taking the CO2 from direct air capture or even from seawater. We can do this today, but not the scale we need. So short-term, go for the point sources because they are available as we speak. We maximize the target fraction in the upgrading process. So we don't use the waxes or the naphthas. We upgrade what we can into the target fraction being marine diesel, or kerosene. And what is not upgradable, we actually recycle it internally. So we would not sell an e-naphtha, we would burn it in a gas turbine to recover energy for mechanical and electrical purposes. So all of this, not going to run through the details because of time, contributes to the war readiness in 5 dimensions. It's resilient, the way this is designed. It's redundant. It's consistent. It's one of the only defense assets which you can design in peacetime, which will have a determined production cost of fuel, fuel quality, and fuel quantity because of its design. It will be green fuel. It will defossilize the armed forces, and we'll be achieving cost minimization because of the economies of scale in production and maintenance. Not because we do the economies of scale in one plant, like the 300, 500 megawatt electrolyzers we've all been dreaming on in the past, but by making one plant and then replicating it. So it's not going to be 1,500 different plants, it's going to be 1,500 of the same type. And that gives us the economies of scale in production. And it's exactly what Narratex has been aiming its business on. And summing it all up, how fast can we do this? We're looking at 6 months of the specification and system design for the first pilot, not because we don't know what we do, but because we want to shape this with a governmental customer. All of this is governmental investments. The purchasing process is the same like you'd be buying an F-35 aircraft. It's not something where Rheinmetall will invest and build this and do offtakes. It's a defense asset. So we're proposing and offering this to defense organizations, defense departments, for them to purchase those systems and to run them. And we'd like to clarify with the customer on how far we want to actually engage in the requirements in those 6 months. 12 to 18 months conceptual design. For any customer, we'd be looking into where to actually roll the replication into. Location selection is the buzzword on this, or the keyword, and doing the first pilot. The first pilot is not a demo plant, it's the golden unit from where we can replicate. And then it's phase 3, where we realize GigaPTX across Europe. So whatever scale we want to do. And this is also where we need the whole European green tech industry to do this, because it's going to be big, it has to be fast, we don't have time. And this is what the big push that we've all been waiting for in the green tech industry, which hasn't been able to be done with market forces. We're talking about an invest of 400 billion euros for this project. And this is exactly the push that we need also from a green tech perspective to get into the economies of scale to get this green transition going. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sheena. You already covered some of the questions which are in the chat. So I will try to sum up some of them because of course, time-wise, we have to be aware that it's already 10. But it was very, very interesting. And you see that already at the participation rate. Until recently, the participation rate increased still. Usually after half an hour of these webinars, it is starting to lowering down. So obviously, we are very interested in that. One question, way I would like to ask to Sheena and maybe also Maximilian, because that is not totally clear to me. And we see that also in some of the questions, for example, concerning costs. Because what you now presented, and I understand for military purposes, for defense purposes, costs are not the main subject, because it's clear that might be more costly than you would calculate for civil usage. But on the other hand, how do you plan or how do you think to include the civil sector here? Because I would assume if you have all these fuel production sites invested in, and if they are there, they should also produce over time, and most of the time, at least that is what we hope, there won't be wartime. So how would you like to, how would you plan or how you think to include the civil sector there? And then one of the questions, and I would pass that to you as well, asks about the cost gap which you most likely have between your quite high, because small scale production costs compared to a complete for civil usage designed production line, which would have then maybe more volume. So what are your ideas here, and how can we understand that? Maybe Sheena, you can start, and Maximilian add.
Yeah, very, very much. And thanks for those great questions. So of course, the idea is those systems are high on capex and very low on opex, because we don't buy electricity; it's produced on site. And hence, if they are state-owned, they will producing fuel every day from electricity, from those energies that is harvested. And we're suggesting to the governments to sell this to the market. So it's governmentally owned fuel, which is compatible to what we need in the civilian sector. So the government can sell this at any price to its population because it's owned by the government. So by doing this, we'll be making e-fuel available. And those systems are dimensioned anyway 5 times from a capacity perspective over compared to what we need for the military in peacetime. So they are over dimensioned. So there will be surplus fuel produced that the government can decide to sell at any price they choose to the market. So really cheap to just get it in, or to put it at any price. Second question, once it is governmental owned, you have different calculation models, because you don't have the weighted average cost of capital that normal civilian investments are bound to. You have different financing costs. So our projections that we have made, if there were 1,500 giga-PTX plants operated and owned by governments, we'll see production cost dropping below 2 euros, 2.50 euros a kilogram of e-fuel. That is not expensive. That is more expensive than the fossils, but it's nowhere near where we are today. So from a perspective, what we will see is fuel cost around this kind of level, which then basically does its own trick on making it cheaper. So the point is, once you do the large scale investment from a defense perspective, at the end, we'll have that technology available in Europe that within the next 20, 30 years then will have this, will be that cheap that the fuel will be cheap on its own. So the cost element is only true for the starting point to roll it out once. It will degrade as we go into the economies of scale once we roll this out.
All right, thank you. Maximilian, you want to add?
No, I think this was pretty comprehensive. Looking at the clock, maybe
All right.
there's another question.
Okay, then I might have maybe also a question I would like to pass over to Irina, not knowing if you also looked into that, because there were, for example, some questions about public procurement rules in Europe. There were also one question about the regulatory framework in Europe in general. So did you look in your studies into the regulatory framework in Europe as it is right now? And do you have any ideas or any proposals how this has to be changed or adjusted to meet those targets, for example, e-fuel production for military purposes?
Sure, I can say a few words about it. We are currently looking at the regulatory framework. In short, essentially every Ministry of Defense in Europe has its own fuel procurement strategy. So that in itself is still an issue when it comes to new alternative fuels, that there should be more joint procurement. So that is something that we're looking at. But specifically in terms of the laws and regulations, I couldn't tell you much more about it right now.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, Sheena, did you look into it already by any chance?
Well, we are kind of, it starts for us differently. Like there's the need for this. Once we have conclusion that we need this, and hence the point is then to go like, okay, if we need this, what kind of regulatory frameworks do need to change from a legal perspective to make the project legal? So we've been engaging with legal consultants on this. There are consultants that actually, legal companies that can do this, that give you advice if you want to execute a project like this. What's the regulations that need to change to make it legally possible? But my point is differently. It starts with the policymakers at this scale where we go like, okay, we need this. It's a necessity to prepare us to be prepared against any aggressor. And once we have that concluded, it's then the point on looking to the regulations to be changed. So it's not us to drive policy making. It's once you get to the point where you say we need this, the other is a logical consequence. Follows that.
Okay, understood. This leads to, I think, a very good question for last remarks from all speakers. From So-Kyung Kang just came in, asking about the political acceptance, or I mean, at the end of the day, we are talking of taxpayers' money which has to be spent there. And of course, I would assume that many citizens and many politicians in Europe are maybe not entirely ready to sell that to their constituents, even though we understand it's necessary. But the question would be, how do you perceive the current developments in the political landscape? Do you see politicians ready and governments ready to step in and to actually prepare and sell all this to their citizens? And maybe in addition to that, what would be your recommendations, or what is your take on what has to be changed actually to get there? Maybe Maximilian, you can start.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I'm not the expert like on everything else that is currently being procured for the military, but I mean, you see basically contracts like billions of euros like going through the press like every single day. So I think generally like the willingness to invest, since the so-called Zeitenwende is definitely there. There's also like great acceptance. I think one thing that we can't stress enough here in this case is that this is an infrastructure that, yes, we made the case very clearly, like is required from a military perspective, but it's also quite useful from a civilian perspective. So I think our case is actually better than, say, buying more tanks or buying more airplanes, which you will not be able to use if there's no war. Yeah, and hopefully you don't have to use them.
Irina?
Yeah, I would add that something I mentioned before, that at the end of the day, the cost for the military has to do with more than just purchasing the fuel. So it has to do with the entire supply chain. And also the costs of not having the fuel during a wartime situation are potentially higher than, well, contributing to an eFuel plant, for instance. So I would say for the military, the costs are also calculated differently. And the most important is having sufficient fuels to win the war.
Thank you, Sheena.
I'll answer with two numbers. There is a decision in Germany to be building underground shelters for the public. Germany has decided to spend 30 billion euros in the next 10 years on that. 30 billion is roughly the money we'd need for GigaPTX in Germany. The extension of the Central European pipeline system into Poland, just the pipe, just doing a pipe, is estimated at 5 billion euros. That just gives you an empty pipe. So we are seeing this kind of expenditures being accepted. And we've been talking to, I think, almost 15 MODs, departments of defense, at this ministries of defense in Europe so far. And what we're seeing is clearly the push towards the resilience. So it's moving towards the acceptance of this. But at this stage, it's a military-dominated capability need. It hasn't touched the civilian space just yet, but it's kind of shifting to this. So the point is, it has to be a governmental acceptance, not a pure MOD push. And once we are at this stage, that nations see it as beneficial for their economies and for societies as a whole, that will be the tipping point. Right? And we're seeing this. So the MODs are getting more and more aligned on working level, on administrative decision level, and also at the political levels. Ministers are going for this. You can see this in the policies, but it's broader. But when that tipping point happens, we'll be successful, and it will be creating jobs. So people will have prosperity out of this. We're shifting from automotive to defense as we speak. But currently, we are hiring people to be building tanks. Tomorrow, tomorrow we surely will be hiring people to be building electrolyzers and Fischer-Tropsch reactors, because that's what we need. So we'll be creating jobs, well-spent taxpayers' money from our perspective.
Yeah, that's a great conclusion, since it also matches with the program of the eFuel Alliance from the very beginning. Also, for other reasons, we always advertised for eFuels also for economic reasons. Nothing new here, just the angle is a very a different one we are have discussed today. So we are at 10:13, so unfortunately we have to wrap up. I'm very sure this will not have been the last of events we are doing on this matter. There will be some more to come, and I assume there will be also some content coming from us in that regard quite soon. Thank you very much, Sheena, Irina, and Maximilian, for your very valuable and interesting contributions and presentations. That was really great.